Hello and welcome to episode 12 of the barn door restoration. Last episode I installed the rear frame rails and got this area roughed in. This episode I did front frame rails. I was planning on having these both completed before doing this episode, but I decided that to cover these front curves a bit more because this is kind of a tricky spot to do. I kind of skimmed over it when I did the rear ones, but I'll show some video of actually forming these pieces and welding them together. There's a lot of ways to do this repair. A lot of times just flat steel will be used and the corners will be welded and then ground off and smoothed. It's a lot of labor and it's hard to get perfect. And it's perfectly acceptable if the bus is just to be fixed to be safe and to be enjoyed. But I want to do a restoration so it looks like it's factory new. You could also have formed this in one piece, which I originally kind of thought I might try, but I realized it was going to take a lot longer than to do it in 3 separate pieces. In order to do one piece, I'd have to make a steel buck to form it over, and that would take a lot more time than doing the whole thing this way. So I want to go a little more over the process for doing these curved parts. Kind of skimmed over it in the last episode where I did the rear frame. So this section of the frame, on both the front and rear where it curves up, tends to rust on them. And that's because they're boxed in back here and boxed off, but open on this end. So the dirt can come in, settles in here, water comes in, settles in this. It causes them to rot out. The frame rails are easy to change just because they're straight bends. But in this section with the curves, it's a little more difficult. So since these were just the frame rails, nothing else, I decided not to try and do them on the frame jig. Put them down and put some wooden blocks around to hold everything straight. That way I could cut it, weld it back together, and have everything in the correct spot. Now, this was set up for another piece, but if I had a welding table, it would be a lot easier, but I have an oil-soaked board instead. So once I had this location blocks screwed down, I then decided to make some bend some Z channel. So basically it's the profile of the bottom of the frame, the same in there, and also this top section here. So to put the curve in, you're stretching one side and you're shrinking the other. Now for regular body metal, you just use a shrinker stretcher and it would be very simple. But this being 14 gauge is too thick for most of the lightweight shrinkers and stretchers. So stretching the metal is pretty easy. I think I covered this in the last episode. I just put it on the vise and I hit it with a hammer and thin the part I want to stretch. That pushes the metal out, pushes it under pressure, starts to curve it. But when I go to put the metal in to make the curve, it stretches the rest of it very easily. So the stretching piece is not difficult. The shrinking side is, because it's very hard to shrink such thick metal. So I just cut slots. So basically it less space for the metal to fill in. So instead of compressing the metal, you're just moving into the gaps. So I cut a slot about every inch, every 2.5 centimeters. But I don't go right to the curve. I stay back a little bit. Keeps the curve nicer. So then I basically just form it well, I just used the vise. There will be videos showing this after this. And I used an old bearing, I think it was, to smooth the metal after. Because doing it kind of crude with it, and just kind of beat it into shape and then smooth it after. I probably could be use a little more finesse with it, but this works. In the end, it's a good result. So yeah, it takes about 10 minutes for each piece to shape them. So once they're shaped, then cut out the parts. I think this is this is one right here. Now you can see why I had to cut it out. There's rust holes all over this. It's all very thin. So I cut out the section that needed to be replaced, and then started fitting in the new pieces, getting them fitted in, getting the curve correct, making sure they're perfectly flat on the sides so it doesn't have a lump in the middle. Once everything's fitted, it's very important to have the metal perfectly flush. If you don't have the if it's offset a little bit, there's no way to smooth it. You'll end up with a step. So they need to be perfectly flush. If they're welded flush, even if they're on an angle, you can form that back straight again, but if they're offset, you can't. So make sure they're perfectly flush. It's a little bit of a trick in this because you have to make sure the bottom is flush. You don't really care about the inside because especially the original frame was different thicknesses. Because of the way it was stamped, it was different thicknesses as you move along it. So it's important to get on the back side to make sure that's perfect. And also, once you have something all lined up and positioned so it's flush, you can't just go along and tack it because every tack you put will move the metal a little bit. So you tack it and it'll move a bit, so you have to kind of move, hold it, tack it, and work your way along, only tacking the spots that are perfectly flush. And then once you get all the parts that are matched up, then you can dolly in the rest of them to get them to go. It's much easier to take the time to do it, to make everything fit perfect, than it is to weld it up and then try to deal with something that doesn't fit quite right. So once it's all tacked in place, I did try it on the frame jig to make sure everything was still right and correct. Then I started and welded in solid. But welding this in solid will make this move, because this metal will shrink, will move around a bit as you're putting so much heat in it. So I welded everything solid down to this piece, left the frame rail just tacked. Welded it both sides, so I made sure I had really good, there wasn't any gaps anywhere. Once that was all done, I then made sure this frame was perfectly straight. On both of them, I ended up having to cut a couple tacks and move it. One was a little high, one was a little low, just a couple of millimeters on the end. But it'd be enough to be pain trying to fit it back in the jig. So cut a couple tacks, moved it perfect, tacked it back. Once it was exact, welded them in solid. So once they're welded, the grinding of the metal, I use basically it's flaps of sandpaper. This is a 40 grit. And I use that to smooth my welds. It's got a slight angle on it, but you can lay that basically flat to your surface and just work your weld until you start to touch the other metal. What happens is you don't get divots. A grinding disc, first they don't cut very smooth. They like to rattle and jump, and they kind of gouge it. It's very hard to get a decent smooth finish with the disc, if not impossible. But these do a fairly good job. You still have to be quite careful not to go too deep, but once you get used to it, it's very easy to just work your way around the weld. I also purchased a finger sander, and this is a really handy tool for certain areas that you really can't get with a disc. You can get in with a finger sander and smooth stuff up. This will be very useful. This is just a very cheap one, but it seems to work well. Once I've finished everything on this piece of frame, I'll come back and finish this. The next step will be actually run a file over it, and then probably 80 grit and an orbital sander to smooth finish it. It'll still have a few little pits and lead putty, but there's rust pitting all over it anyway. That's going to have some putty at the very end before paint, so that's not a big deal. So I guess that's about it for this video. Keep watching for some detailed video of building these curved parts, assembling this. Next video is probably going to be finishing off these frame rails. Actually, I'll already started on the right side. But I also have to build some outriggers and stuff, so we'll see what interests me first, I guess. Well, thanks for watching.